Good morning again. So what I'll be doing here today, it's a very brief presentation, providing some insights from the ITF freight model, but particularly associated with the ITF Transport Outlook, the 2019 edition, and focusing, of course, on the freight part of this publication. And to start with, just to explain a little bit to the ones that might not know this, the Transport Outlook is the flagship publication of the ITF. It comes out every 2 years. The last edition was in 2017. Now, in 2019, this will be released 22 of May, the 22nd of May. It will be in the beginning of the annual ITF summit in Leipzig that this will be released. And this publication does a very broad and I would say long-term perspective on the entire transport sector. So it deals with maritime, of course, but it deals with all transport modes. It deals with all sectors, both passengers and freight. And it issues these forecasts, these long-term forecasts, and also tests different policies of what might happen or not happen, or what can happen if we adopt certain policies and not others. Of course, when we are doing these type of exercises of forecasting what is the future going to be like, especially in a moment like this, in the age we live on now, I think we have to be very aware of the uncertainty that exists. Underlying all of this modeling and all of this forecasts or estimates are always underlying drivers for demand in the transport sector. So we have population, we have the GDP growth or lack thereof, how the trade volumes and trade values are going to develop. Of course, the specific transport policies, and not just transport policies, but policies in general, that, as we are aware, can have a profound impact on, for instance, trade values in international trade and how it's done and how even the logistical chains are organized. Going now a bit further and more specifically about this model, this model or this modeling framework that we employed, it's been developed for some years now. One of the reports it was featured was the capacity to grow related to ports and ports expansion. It was also used in the Decarbonizing Maritime report. It was employed also in the Central Asia Connectivity Project, a project that we are gonna, or a report we're gonna release, I think also around May, more or less. And of course, the outlook that I'm gonna talk a bit more about. And just some elements, this model incorporates all freight activity, national, international, urban, in a consistent framework all together. It also involves all transport modes and the networks of all modes, and these networks are all interconnected, so it also allows for, of course, intermodal, and for maritime, almost all, not all, but lots of the connections are intermodal. It also encompasses mode choice for all these models, for all the routes that are possible, network assignment, so the actually flows are assigned to the networks, and of course this allows us on a very aggregate level, just talking about this very aggregate level, to have estimates for activity, both in tons, ton kilometers, vehicle kilometers, emissions for all these modes, if it's national, international, and then if we want, we can go to lower levels of detail. So, some brief words. Of course, I spoke here, there's a certain level of uncertainty associated with these forecasts, but anyway, the baseline, or our current ambitions, as we call it in this publication scenario, forecast that the freight activity is gonna about triple by 2050, and of course the maritime sector is gonna keep on being the dominant, in terms of volume, tons kilometers, the dominant mode. Of course, this growth is not going to be uniform across the globe. Especially areas in Asia, Africa are where most of the growth is going to come from. Also, in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, there will be a bigger increase in movements than in other seas or oceans. And some words now about some of the parameters we used when I spoke here in our baseline, our current ambition scenario. And then we also have a high ambition scenario. And ambitions, and these ambitions mostly are concerned with the emissions and the impacts on climate change. And the parameters that we use to differentiate these two scenarios have mostly to do with the trade of fossil fuels and how it will evolve. And in any case, it will decrease always, but to what extent will it decrease? So this is one of the parameters that changes. Also the logistics efficiency, and this mostly concerns the average loads on different types of modes and what type of average loads, and for different commodity types, how are they going to evolve. And then the more technical side, efficiency, the carbon intensity per vehicle kilometer has to do more with technological advancements, alternative fuels, but not just that, other improvements to the efficiency, engine efficiency, or the design of the vehicles, etc. But I would say the number one or the big focus of this outlook has to do with disruptions. And as I was saying, we live in uncertain times. Underlying projections or estimates for GDP and trade, international trade, are associated with some uncertainty. But not just that. We are witnessing in the transport sector several major changes that we are already seeing them happening. And these have to do with the technological changes in some instances, but there's also cultural, social changes, social norms that are changing, business models, new forms of organizing work and companies. All of this influences the transport sector. So we went to, as you can see, there's a wide array of areas where we decided to focus and to try to dive a bit deeper and have of what are the possible impacts of these disruptions. Being disruptions, one of the caveats I must here mention is that many of these trends, some of them we are already witnessing, as I told, like e-commerce, it's one of them. We are already seeing this happening. But other of these trends are at least not yet in commercial operation anywhere, like autonomous trucks or even the energy transition for heavy-duty road vehicles. This is something that's actually not for heavy vehicles. It's not yet in commercial operation, but that are things that can happen. And the message here is that when we present these figures, especially concerning these disruptions, we're not saying this is what's going to happen. We are doing a simulation exercise. We're looking into reasonable assumptions of what can be the maximum impacts on different parameters of these disruptions, and then using our model to test and to see, okay, if these assumptions do take place, what will be the impact on the transport sector, on its activity, on the places where transport activity takes place, the emissions, etc. And so, for instance, in e-commerce, one of the things, the way this works, it's an increase in the volumes of activity that takes place. In 3D printing, what we assumed was a decrease in the trade volumes that take place, and this is different for different commodities. In new trade routes, when we mentioned this, we mentioned one of the issues is, of course, the One Belt, One Road initiative. but also the opening of Arctic to regular shipping. And then I'm also going to talk briefly about these heavy-duty vehicles, energy transition, autonomous trucks, and high-capacity vehicles. Before I go in detail to each one of these, just to say that specifically in the freight sector, when we tested these disruptions, it was where I would say there were bigger changes, more even than in the passenger side. There were changes in the routes, in the logistic changes. There's the possibility of big modal shifts happening, steep decreases in costs for some modes of transport. So this all can have a very big impact on how transport is done. And of course, this makes also difficult to plan, and I think this is one of the points of this roundtable here, very timely. So it also makes it's difficult to plan for infrastructure investments under this context. And these are things that should be taken in account when making these decisions. So, about the new trade routes and how we modeled this and what some of the outcomes were. Here, I would say the main or the more impactful change, according to the assumptions we employed, was the opening up of the Arctic to regular shipping, because this would indeed signify a big or a shift from the Indian and from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. Of course, we're not saying it's not going to stop the shipping on the Indian. It's still gonna be the main one of the main routes or one of the main oceans, but it will indeed have a big impact. In terms of the Central Asia infrastructure projects, One Belt, One Road initiative, it will also have an impact. It will also increase the flow of goods by land between East Asia and Europe. But not only that, and I think this is also going to be discussed in this roundtable, it's not just the connection between East Asia and Europe, but also the access from Central Asia to different ports than nowadays. And this is also a thing we can see from our results. Then issue of e-commerce. As I said, here it's assumed it's going to increase the volume of activity, and this increase will affect mostly, I would say, it affects every mode, but particularly more air freight and the air sector. This has to do with the type of commodities involved in this type of trades, even the type of commodities that are forecasted to increase more into the future, more high-value goods, for instance, but has also to do with other phenomena like an increase in the peer-to-peer commerce and trade, more directly from customer to producer. Also the tightening of the delivery times. This will all, and related with e-commerce, will in a way leverage the air sector more than other transportation modes. 3D printing has a bit the opposite impact, because here the underlying assumption, also based in the literature, was that this would decrease the international trade volumes. And in decrease the international trade volumes, not uniformly across all types of commodities, but of course affecting more manufactured goods, electronics, and less bulk commodities. So in this case, air would be the mode that would decrease more compared to the baseline. When we say decrease, I'm saying decrease compared to the baseline, to decrease more. But also sea, because it's also very associated with international flows. Then energy transition for long distance road freight. We use this technological neutral designation for this change. This can involve different types of technologies, highways or electric roads, batteries, hydrogen, There's talk also about low carbon fuels, biodiesels, etc., synthetic fuels. So we're not putting our finger in any one of these options. But assuming there is this indeed this energy transition, one of the things we model here was also how the costs will change, and in the short term, the costs would be probably higher or will be higher. By 2030, depending on different regions, it can be relatively equivalent to what it is today, but by 2050 should be lower. And what this means is that by 2050 there can be, because of this, some modal shift from rail and inland waterways towards road due to this decrease in costs. This is even more the case for autonomous trucks, because in autonomous trucks the potential, and again I'm saying we're not because in the text, let me make here a parenthesis, when you read the outlook, you'll say that for each of these disruptions, we talk what are the key drivers behind it, what is triggering these changes, but also what are the barriers to their adoption, what are the caveats here involved. So this is something, because actually nowadays there's some tests, but there's no autonomous trucks still in operation. But assuming this would go forward, this would dramatically decrease the transport costs for road freight and for transport in general, I would say, which would drive demand up. And this, even more than the previous disruption, would imply a big modal shift from both inland waterways and railways towards road. And to finish, the story about the high-capacity vehicles, and this we are talking about road freight high-capacity vehicles, heavier trucks than we already have in operation. In some countries like Finland in Europe, they are already allowed. And in this case, there will also be a cost decrease associated with this. It will be lower, this cost decrease, than with autonomous trucks, but it will still also mean some shift from rail and inland waterways towards road freight. And so this was a brief overview. As you say, everything is not related with the maritime sector, but I do hope it leaves and it provides a good starting point, and it touches some of the points we are going to discuss in this roundtable. And of course, I'm able to or willing to answer any question or comment, etc. So thank you very much.